It started with a blinking red light that shouldn't have been there, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, not just because it was pointed at my backyard, but because it was pointed at my kid. My daughter Lily was the one who noticed it first, which somehow made it worse, like the universe decided the most innocent pair of eyes in the house would be the one to catch something that ugly. She was in the pool that afternoon, late summer heat. One of those quiet Tuesdays where nothing feels like it could go wrong, and she just stops mid-splash and says, "Dad, what's that red dot?" I thought she meant a reflection at first, sunlight bouncing off a window or something. But when I walked over and followed her finger through the slats of our wooden fence, there it was, steady, blinking, deliberate. A camera. Not just any camera either, but one of those dome-style security ones, mounted high, angled down like it had a job to do. And the job was my backyard. Now, I wish I could say I was surprised, but the truth is, if you had to pick one guy in our neighborhood who might pull something like this, it would have been him. Not Craig. Well, not Craig anymore, but let's call him Russell Haynes. Mid-50s, always wore those pressed golf polos even when he wasn't golfing, drove a black SUV that never seemed to have a speck of dust on it, and carried himself like he'd been elected mayor of the block instead of HOA president. Russell didn't just like rules, he liked being the one who reminded everyone they existed, and if he could invent a few along the way, even better. We'd had our moments before, nothing explosive, just those quiet little frictions that build up over time. He once left a printed notice in my mailbox about the visual inconsistency of my lawn edging. Another time, he knocked on my door to mention that my trash bins were visible from the street for longer than recommended. Stuff like that. Petty, but persistent. Still cameras? Pointed directly into my yard? That crossed a line so clearly it didn't even feel like a gray area. I stood there for a good minute, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, hoping there was some angle I hadn't considered, some explanation that didn't make me feel like my family had been quietly put on display without our consent. But the angle didn't lie. The camera was mounted on the side of Russell's garage, just high enough to peek over our fence, tilted perfectly toward our pool deck. And when I took a step to the left, then to the right, the lens followed the same space, tracking the exact area where Lily had been swimming. "Go inside for a minute, kiddo," I said, trying to keep my voice even. She didn't argue, which told me she felt it too. That weird, creeping discomfort you can't quite name when something's off. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my yard like I was seeing it for the first time, every corner suddenly feeling less private than it had that morning. I spotted the second camera a few minutes later, mounted a little lower, angled differently, but still catching a wide sweep of my backyard. 2 cameras. Not accidental. Not casual. Intentional. I didn't march over there right away. I thought about it. Sure, rehearsed a few versions of how that conversation would go, most of them ending badly. Russell wasn't the kind of guy you reason with easily. He was the kind of guy who'd quote bylaws at you mid-sentence and somehow make you feel like you were the one out of line for even asking a question. So instead, I did something a little more controlled. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and wrote him a letter. Not an email, not a text, a certified letter. The kind that says, "I'm documenting this." I kept it simple, direct, professional. I acknowledged that the cameras were physically on his property, but I stated clearly that their current positioning appeared to capture my private backyard space, including my pool area, and that I was formally requesting they be removed or redirected within 14 days. No threats, no accusations, just a boundary. When I dropped it off at the post office the next morning, I remember thinking, maybe this is one of those situations that resolves itself quietly. Maybe he didn't realize how intrusive it looked. Maybe he'd adjust them, we'd never speak of it again, and life would go back to normal. Yeah, that's not what happened. 3 days later, instead of a knock on the door or even a note in return, I got a letter from a law firm. Thick envelope, formal letterhead, the whole thing. I opened it standing in my driveway, already feeling that slow burn start in my chest. It was a response on Russell's behalf, stating that the cameras were installed for security purposes, fully within his property boundaries, and entirely compliant with local regulations. Therefore, he had no obligation to remove or reposition them. No mention of my privacy. No acknowledgement of my concern. Just legal positioning. I read it twice, maybe 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't missing something between the lines, some hint of compromise, or even basic neighborly decency. Nothing. It was cold, clean, and final. And here's the thing. Technically, he wasn't wrong. The cameras were on his property. The law, at least at a surface level, wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be. But standing there, holding that letter, knowing that somewhere behind that fence there were two lenses pointed at the space where my daughter swam, where my family relaxed, where we thought we were alone, I realized something. If he wanted to play this by the book, then so would I. Just maybe not the same book he was expecting. So that night, after Lily went to bed and the house finally quieted down, I sat out back with a beer I barely touched and just watched the fence, watched that faint red blink through the slats like it had a pulse of its own, and I kept thinking about that letter, the tone of it, how clean and detached it was, like my backyard was just a line item in some policy manual. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Russell wasn't protecting his property. He was asserting control, and the cameras weren't just about security. They were about reminding everyone around him that he could do whatever the rules technically allowed, and no one would push back hard enough to stop him. That was the part that didn't sit right with me. Not the cameras themselves, but the assumption behind them. I've always been a pretty even-tempered guy, not the type to escalate things unless I absolutely have to, but I do believe in drawing lines when they matter, and this mattered. Not just for me, but for my family, for the sense that our home was still our own space, not something casually observed by a neighbor with too much authority and too little restraint. So I started thinking differently. If he wanted to lean on technically allowed, then I needed to understand exactly what that meant, not just for him, but for me too. The next morning, I made a few calls. First to a local attorney, just a consultation, nothing formal yet, and I laid out the situation as calmly as I could. He listened, asked a couple of pointed questions about camera angles, visibility, whether they were capturing areas where there was a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that phrase stuck with me. Reasonable expectation of privacy. He didn't tell me I had a slam dunk case, not even close, but he did say something that shifted the whole board in my head. If those cameras are clearly recording into your enclosed backyard, especially a recreational area like a pool, you may have grounds to challenge it, but it's not always quick, and it's not always clean. Not quick, not clean. That sounded about right. Then I called an electrician, not because I had a plan yet, at least not a fully formed one, but because I had an idea starting to take shape, something that lived in that gray space between completely legal and deeply inconvenient. A guy named Marcus showed up that afternoon, late 30s, easygoing, the kind of person who doesn't ask too many questions unless you give him a reason to. We walked the fence line together, and I pointed out the roof line of Russell's garage, the angle of the cameras, the general layout of both properties. Marcus squinted up at it, hands on his hips, then looked back at me like he already knew where this was going. "You want light," he said, half smiling. "I want security," I replied, matching his tone just enough to let him know I wasn't joking. He nodded slowly, like he respected the phrasing. "Motion activated, high sensitivity," I said. "And I want coverage, thorough coverage." What we ended up designing wasn't subtle. 6 commercial-grade floodlights, spaced evenly along the back fence, each one positioned and calibrated to pick up movement starting right around the edge of Russell's roofline. Not on his property, technically, but right where anything happening near those cameras would register as motion from my side. Marcus double-checked local codes, made sure everything we were installing was compliant, even wrote up a quick confirmation for me stating that the setup met all residential lighting regulations. By the time he finished installing them, the sun was already starting to dip, that golden hour light hitting everything just right, and for a brief moment, it almost felt peaceful again, like maybe I'd overthought the whole thing. Then the first light went off. It was subtle at first, just one fixture clicking on as a car passed somewhere behind Russell's house, the beams spilling over the fence line, bright, but not blinding. Then another one triggered, then another, like a chain reaction. Marcus glanced back at me, raised an eyebrow, and I just shrugged. "Looks like it works." He laughed, packed up his tools, and headed out. That night, that's when it really started. I was sitting in the living room, TV on low, not really watching anything, just waiting, if I'm being honest. And then, click, one light. A few seconds later, click, click, 2 more. Then a full sweep, all 6 firing up like someone had flipped a switch in sequence. The backyard lit up like a stadium for a few seconds, then dropped back into darkness, only to flare up again moments later. It didn't take long to realize how sensitive the system really was. A breeze strong enough to move the branches near the fence, click. A car driving down the street behind Russell's property, click. Some poor moth deciding to take the scenic route past his gutter, click. Over and over. I pulled up the system log on my phone, watching the triggers stack up in real time, timestamps ticking by faster than I expected. 10 activations in the first hour, 20 by midnight. By the time I finally went to bed, it had passed 30, and I remember lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the lights cycling on and off outside, and thinking, yeah, this is going to get his attention. At exactly 6:02 the next morning, my phone rang. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. I let it ring. Then it went to voicemail. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. And again. By the time I finally checked it, there were 3 missed calls and 1 voicemail. I played it on speaker while I made coffee, leaning against the counter like it was just another message. His voice came through tight, controlled, but there was an edge to it now that I hadn't heard before. Evan, this is Russell. We need to talk about those lights you installed. They were going off all night. It's excessive, it's disruptive, and frankly, it's unacceptable. I expect you to address this immediately. I smiled a little, not because I was enjoying it. Well, maybe a little, but because for the first time since this whole thing started, the discomfort wasn't one-sided anymore. I didn't call him back. Instead, I waited. 2 days later, I got the official notice. HOA complaint, filed by Russell Haynes, citing nuisance lighting and disturbance of neighborhood peace. Formal hearing scheduled. Attendance required. I read through it slowly, then set it down on the table next to the original letter from his attorney. And for a moment, I just sat there, letting the symmetry of it sink in. He used the system to push me. Now I was going to use it to push back. In the days leading up to the hearing, I got organized. Printed copies of the state's privacy statutes, highlighted the sections about recording into areas where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, pulled together photos of the camera angles, showing exactly what they could see from their current positions. And just to round it out, I went down to the county sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint, not because I expected them to kick down his door over it, but because documentation matters, and I wanted a record that this wasn't just a neighborly dispute. It was something more. When the day of the hearing came, the room looked exactly how you'd expect. Long table, a handful of board members trying to look impartial, a couple of neighbors sitting in the back pretending they weren't interested, and Russell, sitting across from me, posture straight, expression composed, like he'd already decided how this was going to go. For a second, we just looked at each other. No smiles, no nods, just acknowledgement. And then it began. The chair of the board cleared her throat, shuffled a few papers, and just like that, it was official. Not a neighborly disagreement anymore, not something you could brush off over a fence line, but a documented conflict sitting in a room with fluorescent lights and people pretending they didn't already have opinions. Russell went first. Of course he did. He always did. He leaned forward slightly, hands folded, voice measured, calm in that way that's almost rehearsed, and he painted the picture exactly how I expected him to. The lighting installed along Mr. Carter's fence line has created repeated disturbances during nighttime hours, he said, glancing briefly at me before looking back at the board. The frequency and intensity of these lights are excessive and disruptive to the surrounding properties. Surrounding properties, plural, like he was speaking for the whole neighborhood. I almost admired the confidence. When it was my turn, I didn't rush it. I stood up, took a second, let the room settle just a bit, and then I started simple. I installed those lights as a security measure, I said, keeping my tone steady, not defensive, not aggressive, just factual. Every fixture is compliant with local code. I have documentation from a licensed electrician confirming that. I slid the paper across the table, not dramatically, just enough for it to land where it needed to. A couple of board members leaned in, scanning it, nodding slightly. Russell shifted in his seat, just a little. Then I reached into my folder and pulled out the next set of documents, the ones I'd spent the most time on. I'd also like to address why those lights were installed in the first place. I continued, and that's when I saw it, the smallest flicker of tension cross his face. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. I placed the printed photos on the table, one by one. each showing the angle of his cameras, the line of sight over my fence, the clear view into my backyard. No exaggeration, no edits, just reality. These cameras, I said, tapping one of the images lightly, are positioned in a way that captures my private backyard space, including my pool area. One of the board members looked up at Russell. Is that accurate? They're on my property. He replied immediately, like he'd been waiting for that question. They're for security purposes. I'm not disputing where they're mounted, I said, gently cutting in, still calm, still controlled. I'm pointing out what they can see. There was a pause then, not long, but long enough for the room to shift just a little, for the conversation to move out of the neat little box Russell had tried to keep it in. And that's when I put the last piece on the table. I've also filed a complaint with the county sheriff's department regarding potential privacy violations, I said, placing the receipt down in front of them. Not slammed, not emphasized, just set there like it belonged. You could feel it, the air changed. It wasn't just about lights anymore. Russell leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have an immediate response. He looked at the papers, then at the board, then back at me, like he was recalibrating in real time. This is retaliatory, he finally said, his voice a notch sharper now. The lights are clearly meant to harass. I let that sit for a second before answering. They're meant to protect my property, I said. Just like your cameras, right? That landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but it landed. The board went quiet for a moment, exchanging looks, flipping through the documents, and I could tell they were doing that internal math people do when something that seemed simple suddenly isn't. On one side, a complaint about bright lights. On the other, documented concerns about privacy, a potential legal issue, and a paper trail that didn't go away once the meeting ended. About 15 minutes later, after a few more questions, a bit more back and forth, they called for a vote. 5-2. Complaint dismissed. Just like that. No speech, no grand declaration, just a decision entered into the record. Russell nodded once, tight, controlled, like he was trying to keep the loss from showing too clearly, then gathered his papers without looking at me. I didn't say anything either. There wasn't anything left to say in that room. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, I was out back early in the morning, coffee in hand, the kind of quiet you only get right after sunrise, when I noticed something different. The red blink, it wasn't there anymore. At first, I thought maybe the cameras were off. Maybe he decided to take them down completely. But when I stepped closer to the fence and adjusted my angle, I saw them, still mounted, still active, just turned. Both of them now faced inward, toward his own driveway. No announcement, no apology, no acknowledgement of any kind. Just corrected. A few days after that, I got a follow-up letter from the sheriff's department. Formal warning issued. Nothing dramatic, no fines or charges, but it went on record, which, for someone like Russell, probably mattered more than anything else. As for the lights, they're still there. I did turn the sensitivity down a bit once the cameras moved. No reason to keep lighting up the night over nothing, but I didn't remove a single fixture. Not out of spite, not anymore, but as a reminder. Not just for him, but for me too. Because the thing about all of this, the part that stuck with me long after the meeting and the letters and the quiet repositioning, is how easy it is for lines to get blurred when no one pushes back. How quickly technically allowed can turn into morally questionable if nobody's willing to stand in that uncomfortable space and say, no, this isn't right. I don't think Russell ever saw himself as the bad guy. Honestly, I think in his head, he was just enforcing order, keeping things the way he believed they should be. But somewhere along the way, that sense of control crossed into something else, something that overlooked the people it was supposed to coexist with. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not about cameras or lights or HOA bylaws, but about boundaries. The kind you don't always see on paper, but you feel the moment they're crossed. My backyard is quiet again now. Lily swims without asking questions about blinking lights. My wife reads on the deck without glancing over her shoulder. And for the most part, things have settled back into something that feels like normal. But every now and then, when those floodlights click on for a second, maybe a car passes, maybe the wind picks up, I notice it. Not in a tense way, not anymore, just aware. Because sometimes, peace isn't about removing every defense. Sometimes it's about knowing it's there if you need it. So I'm curious, if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have gone straight to legal action, tried to talk it out face to face, or done exactly what I did and let the situation correct itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear where you land on this, because situations like this, they're never as simple as they look from the outside.